would you say polarization in debate, discourse, and perhaps even in society increased with the advent of the internet and social media? And if so, why do you think this is so?
Uh, I mean, this is a strong impression rather than any form of
Right.
analysis. So
Yeah.
I think we feel as if it has increased because social media has become part of our daily routine, and way too much because, and I think it increases even more in a lockdown scenario.
Yeah.
Morning to night, you're always on social media, constantly checking on it. And can you imagine a scenario where we don't check our phone or internet every hour? I don't think we can imagine that anymore.
Yeah.
But just 10 years back, when we were all in Gokhale, I didn't do that. I didn't have a smartphone. And
Right.
it feels weird to say it, but I can't imagine that scenario anymore. So I think for that reason, the polarization feels much closer. You can't get away from it. So for that reason, I think it feels worse. And I think feeling worse makes it a reality. That polarization is increasing. I think that's how I see it.
So, am I cherry picking data? For example, there was this news about I forget who divorced whom, but one either the husband or the wife joined a political party, and the other person chose to divorce that person, or said that they would divorce the person because they would join the other political party. So, forget who joined whom and what.
Yeah.
Am I cherry picking the data, or is this sort of political divide? You keep hearing about news from America about how Republicans will not allow their children to marry into a Democratic family and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Is this selective cherry picking on my part, or?
No, I think in political science, there is a discourse around this. So I think I forget the second author's name, which I shouldn't because I taught it last semester. The first author, his name is Daniel Ziblatt. So he's written a book called How Democracies Die. And I think there is a discourse around this in the USA for the last 15, 20 years. And I think a book written by Fareed Zakaria, a non-fiction book 15 years ago, was about illiberal democracies. And one of the core arguments that they make is about the loss of norms. The loss of norms, what it means is that the basic courtesies that you expect in a democratic debate, we don't expect that anymore. And I think we can clearly see it with how Donald Trump operated in the last 5-6 years. That there is no respect, and that part of a lack of respect has become part of politics. And this has contributed to illiberal democracy. They're very careful to say that it's not the death of democracies, but it's the lack of liberalism within a democratic framework. And that increases polarization. So the scenario that you mentioned about husband and wife divorcing each other because of political, I mean, I've seen that with relationships. I mean, it's really common right now. And I think within our families, we must have experienced this after elections in the last 5-6 years. So there is definitely that playing a part, and social media has accentuated it for sure in a very personal.
Absolutely. So feeding off what you just said, two different questions. The first is, what role should we in academia play to the extent that we think we should foster a more civil form of discourse? What should we be changing in academia to make this happen for the generations to come?
Yeah. So now in academics, there definitely has to be a space for exchanging ideas without ridicule. And I say that not just from the point of view of whether your ideas are left or right, but also if your ideas are ill-formed. That is, class, you have to allow students to make mistakes. And I think without that, you'll always find a lot of students being quiet. And having been in your class 10 years ago, I can definitely say I was one of those students who never spoke up in class. And, I rarely ever remember speaking up in class. And in Ashoka, discussion sessions are there to especially address the situation, where you see that there are a large number of students who just don't speak in class. And you have sort of a part of your grades that are meant for participation. So it's like, if you need more marks, you better speak up in class. And I think one of the things that I work with Professor Sitapati in my university, so something that he insists is that or at least when we were in a real classroom, not a virtual one, if a student speaks twice in a class and he raises his hand for the third time, he'll say, I think you've spoken twice, somebody else.
Oh, nice.
Like, he's very particular about that, where he tries to ensure that all students speak up rather than just one or two hogging the class. We've all been part of classrooms where that happens. And you might also say that it's kind of penalizing the students who are very enthusiastic, but I think when you are in a large classroom, you have to cater to all the students. And it also serves the other purpose for which you asked the question in the first place, which is that academics has to foster different kinds of ideas. And for that, especially in political science, in a politically charged atmosphere, I'll tell you an example, something we had to deal with in the first semester that I taught in Ashoka, where we were teaching citizenship right in the middle of the Citizenship Amendment Act. Imagine the scenario there, and protest. I was studying in a university where my classmates were basically arrested. So it's impossible to have some form of neutral debate. So in that scenario, you have to come out and say what has happened. And you have to also give the caveat that if you're speaking in this class, you have to be civil and you have to be open to ideas. It's always a difficult scenario, and it will always go haywire. I'm pretty sure about it. But I think it's worth trying anyway.
So from an operational viewpoint, if you have a reasonably large class, so say maybe more than 60 students, do you divide class for these discussion sessions, or is it all 60 together?
Yeah, so discussion sessions are meant to be smaller groups.
Right.
So for the coming semester, I have 50 students that I have to take care of, and we are part of 3 discussion groups.
Okay.
So this is to ensure that you don't have, practically sometimes you do have more students than that, but ideally you shouldn't have more than 15 students. During the course of an hour, I sort of think of it this way. Each student should at least get 4 minutes, but that doesn't happen because you end up speaking more. But in that scenario, I try to see if someone is not speaking, I ask them a question directly, especially the kind of thing I hated from my teachers. I'm practically doing it to my students. But I see a lot of value in that, because one thing students have appreciated, I think, after a semester is that they've actually thanked me for making them look stupid. And in the sense that it's probably the first time they've actually come out and said something. And after they say it a few times, they realize that it's not a big deal to get things wrong. And you need to get through that stage where you're not, where you're afraid of speaking. So you just get over that. And the one of Professor Sitapathi's principles is that when you're young, get over it, because as you get older, it's much harder to get over it. And I think that works. Broadly, it works.
Absolutely. So I don't know if I ever told you guys this, but when I was a student, I actually used to get sweaty palms at the thought of raising my hand to ask a question. So it was always a very scary experience speaking to a professor. And like you, I've gone to the other side now, and I make my living by speaking in public. And it's like you said, you have to get over your fear of making a mistake. And as teachers, I have made mistakes. I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah.
That's what they are. They're mistakes. I don't think there needs to be a problem about it. It's something I should try and figure out if we can get started at Berkeley Institute. Discussion groups have never happened, and perhaps they should.
Yeah.
Coming back to an earlier point that you had raised about the book about the death of democracy, was it?
How Democracies Die.
How Democracies Die. There was another book that I was reminded of while you were speaking about this. This is a book written by Ezra Klein. I think it's called Polarization or Polarized Societies. I don't quite remember. But he did a podcast with Tyler Cowen, in which Tyler Cowen asked him if polarization, while definitely having increased on the political spectrum, has it actually gone down along other dimensions? So the point that he raised was about sports. So the kind of passion that sports fans used to have in the 80s and 90s in America seems to have gone down, but the opportunity cost of that is polarization along political spectrums have gone up. Can you, to the extent that it is possible to do so, can you draw a comparison with India? If we are right about political polarization having gone up, along what dimensions is Indian society more united now than it was in the past? Caste, language, ethnicity, race, gender, whatever it may be.
Well, I mean, I always find it difficult to apply those sort of concepts in the Indian case because I think in political science, increasingly, I think South Asia scholars usually deal with this.
Yeah.
And I think Pratap Bhanu Mehta has written extensively about this. The idea that we are a group-based society, India, and we always find these sort of ideas of forming groups as necessity as part of us as a necessary part of our society, and then on top of that, our colonial history and the way a democracy was established in India, it came about in a situation where democracy basically works with the idea of one person, one vote.
Yeah.
You're trying to apply a concept of individual liberty or individual freedom of choice to a group-based society. So a lot of our outcomes, which we find weird, come from that sort of an application. People often don't see it that way, and I definitely didn't see it that way until I actually read Pratap Bhanu Mehta and political science in detail. And I think in public economics, you yourself taught us those collective choice issues, collective problems by Mankuru.
Rose Condorcet and yeah.
Yeah, and it's when you think of it that way, the Tyler Cowen's points, and I used to read Vox quite regularly. I haven't done it.
Neither have I. Yeah. So he's no longer there, by the way. He's left now, joined NYT.
So I think Ezra Klein, I've listened to him a lot, and Tyler Cowen also, Marginal Revolution and all of that. But,
of course.
So the idea of sports teams, and I find that parallel interesting because tribalism in sports is a big thing, and I'm glad I blurred my background because if you can see there, you can see a banner there, and at that banner.
Arsenal, is it? I can Arsenal, yes. Okay.
So I'm talking
my sympathies.
So the tribalism in sports is also this tendency to form groups and finding some sort of solidarity in that group, and that necessity to find solidarity results in really weird outcomes. And I think if you read Ashutosh Varshney's works on riots, I find that to be really good explainers, or at least it's a very different way of thinking. So I think his research on ethnic conflict in South Asia and Southeast Asia is something that has given me a lot of insight into how this operates, because he's looked at this idea of why there is ethnic tensions. And when do ethnic tensions result not just in conflict. When we mean conflict, I think conflict is a necessary part of democracy. Democracy, we build institutions within democracy to institutionalize conflict so that it doesn't spill over. Now, the way Ashutosh Varshney theorizes it and his empirical work has shown that when you move from that sort of a conflict to violence, so what are the circumstances that lead to violence? He inevitably comes to the conclusion that in India, violence is more sporadic and it never spreads throughout the country, whether it is religious or caste. So if you talk about issues of caste-based violence or religion-based violence, the most violent episodes in India's history ever, it has always been confined to a region. It's never been the case that it spread throughout the whole country. You can talk about anything from Delhi to Ahmedabad to Surat, wherever it has happened. It's only been in that city. Caste violence is as well, whether it's whichever village it has happened in Tamil Nadu or Bihar, it's always been in a village. Right. But take that scenario in Sri Lanka or Indonesia, it is throughout the country. And in Sri Lanka, it went into a full-blown civil war.
Yeah.
Now, the reason being that is that India has so many different group loyalties that it's very, very difficult to find cross-solidarity among those groups. So in that sense, the very fact that India is diverse leads to a kind of unity. And it's not the unity and diversity that we say in a jingoistic form. It's the kind of unity and diversity that plays out in a very pragmatic way. So, but in Sri Lanka, on the other hand, you have large groups of 2 or 3 ethnicities, and they are in conflict with each other over power, political power. So that results in ethnic conflict that goes into full-blown civil war. So it's always the case that a country like Sri Lanka or Indonesia are more at risk of going into that sort of an complete breakdown of society due to polarization. But India, in a very unorthodox, counterintuitive way, stays together because we are so diverse. That's the most convincing explanation I have found.
So as an economist, I worry, and I'm sure there are answers, but and my reading of political science is amateurish at best. But I worry about how you might want to prove a hypothesis such as this, but that I suppose is a topic for another day. But based on what you just said, and I think this discussion is going to last for at least 2 hours. Based on what you just said, there's this person I follow on Twitter. It's important to state at the outset that I don't agree with his views, but his name is Srikant Krishnamachari, and he has hypothesized that one unifying factor in India is caste. That because of all of the other axes that divide us, whether it is religion, whether it is gender, whether it is linguistics, whatever it may be, caste unifies us because he says, I'm much more likely to feel affinity towards a person of the same caste, no matter which part of the country he comes from. So his contention, his case, is that caste across the entire length and breadth of the country is a unifying factor precisely because we are so large and so diverse in so many other dimensions. I find it to be an interesting idea worth thinking about, while strongly disagreeing with the idea that therefore there is a reason to preserve the structure of caste. But what do you think about the idea itself? Does it hold merit?
Well, I don't know, because caste is not an observable phenomenon, right? Unlike race or ethnicity, race, I should say race, not ethnicity. So race is observable, and which is why a lot of the socioeconomic discrimination that one experiences due to race are also easier to study.
Right.
Caste is much more difficult to observe. And for that reason, and also caste, the way we see it, it's not just 4 castes, right? It's thousands, and even within caste now you have subcaste loyalties that play a lot of role in politics. We have ethnicity-based parties and sub-ethnicity-based parties that are arguing for trying to curry favor within certain political scenarios, and that itself has become a whole field of study in South Asia. So for that reason, I don't know if caste can be a unifying factor. And on top of that, well, obviously the justice element of looking at caste in any way. So I wouldn't go that.
Exactly. Like I said, I strongly disagree with the idea, but I found it interesting and a very contrarian viewpoint to my outlook. And I wasn't able to come up with a very easy refutation, if you will. And therefore, I found the idea interesting. I would like to speak to more people about this. And if you can recommend some literature, not just to me, but to everybody else in the call, I would love to find out more. And now, if I could segue from here into your area of research, I believe your PhD is in labor economics. One of the most fascinating papers that I read last year was a paper written, I'm probably going to get the name wrong, I think by a lady called Suana Oh. I might be wrong about that. Her research was fascinating to me. What she did is she offered monetary payments to people from different castes in India and asked them to do jobs that typically would not be done by people from that particular caste.
Right.
Both upwards and downwards, so to speak, if you were to think about the conventional way of thinking about the hierarchy of caste. So it was asking so-called upper caste people to do jobs that are typically associated with lower caste people and vice versa. And a statistically significant number of respondents refused to do jobs that fell out of their own caste limits, as it were.
Right.
So even monetary benefits prohibit you. And by the way, this was true across the domain. So it wasn't as if you aspired to do something that was seen as being above your caste. If it is not within your caste, then it is not something that you're going to want to do.
Yeah.
Which, as an economist and someone who's been brought up in the traditional rational way of thinking about economics, was, to use modern parlance, mind-blowing.
Yeah.
What explains this? What is? Should I be surprised, or is this something that wouldn't surprise somebody who studied caste and labor in India?
Yeah, I think something that when you're studying economics, one of the reasons why I kind of moved away from economics after my MA was this reason, that I found a lot of literature in political science, anthropology quite interesting. And caste was one of the biggest reasons why I moved away from
economics.
In around 10 years ago. When I say moved away from economics, not this field as a whole, but I wanted to have a more interdisciplinary approach to things. And even interdisciplinary, when I say, I don't mean interdisciplinary in the way economists say it. Interparadigmatic might be a more accurate term, because even the subject of political economy, the way economists see it, is quite different from the way a political scientist sees it. So in the issue of caste, so anthropologists and sociologists have studied caste far longer than economists have. So in the last, I think 15, 20 years, you've seen an explosion of economics of caste literature. I think when I was there in Gokhale, like for some reason I can't remember name. He's someone very famous. I shouldn't be forgetting his name, but yeah, of course, Sukhdev Thorat. Sukhdev Thorat spoke at Gokhale Institute the year I was there, and he's one of the pioneers of this economics of caste approach. And since then, Ashwini Deshpande, who's at Ashoka University now, she was in Delhi school before.
Yeah,
she's also written a book called Grammar of Caste.
Correct.
So in that she's summarized all the kinds of studies that have taken place related to caste. But all of these follow the typical neoclassical approach and introducing caste as sort of an unexplained productivity differential. So it's like all the things you can't explain through economics, there is something there which is not explaining it, that might be caste.
It's a solo residual of economics of caste.
So I find that sort of study is also very unconvincing. So, and that's why the result that you just mentioned becomes very important. So anthropologists study these sort of issues quite in detail. And I think more recently, sociologists who wanted to go into caste look at a concept called structuration. Now, I say that I'm trying to understand this much better. And I wish I had used it in my thesis a lot more. Because my thesis was about the IT sector. And I was trying to see how do you bring in the element of caste in something like the IT sector. So I'm trying to find parallels with the study you just mentioned, where so if someone has to say or empirically prove that there is caste-based discrimination. We all know caste is an issue, but empirically proving that caste-based discrimination takes place is a whole different ballgame. And when you use anthropological approach, you can sort of come to these nuances of how caste becomes a proxy for certain choices that employers make. And it's not necessarily the case that employers look at the caste and discriminate against them. So it's not the explicit caste-based discrimination that you are usually documented in villages. But what takes place in urban areas is caste becomes a representation of certain other characteristics. Let's say if you're from a rural area, it's likely that you're also from a certain caste. And that itself can be an explainer for why employers make certain choices about you. Yeah. And so when you look at those sort of issues, so structuration is one such concept that they've looked at. And so recently there's been a magnum opus by Jonathan Parry, who's a faculty of anthropology at London School. And his book, I don't even know how you begin to do it, because it's an ethnographic work that spans 30 years. And it's incredible in scope. And what he's tried to do is actually try to explain the life of people in Bhilai. Now, Bhilai being a city that was basically built out of the ashes, and the Bhilai steel plant being the center of that city. And he tries to explain how people's lives change and how the state influences the lives of people through the establishment of this plant and the kind of labor relations that exist in these plants. And through this structuration approach, he actually tries to show how caste plays a role in who goes into what type of employment, who gets the contract, who gets the permanent job. And essentially, when you look at all the data, you can actually see that upper castes tend to get the permanent jobs, while lower castes tend to get relegated to the contractual jobs. And he distinguishes between one as Naukri and the other as Kam. So it's Naukri and Kam work. So it's very interesting. And these sort of approaches try to get into caste in much more detail. So I think that's where I come from when I went into labor studies. my interest was that to see that surely caste has been studied extensively in sociology and anthropology. Why can't we just emulate that in economics and make it economic sociology instead of bringing economics to clearly a very abstract and very hard to define phenomenon? So I think when you look at it that way, sometimes the basic economic tools that we use look a little archaic, or rather than archaic, it's more like you have to have a toolbox, right?
Yeah.
So you can't just take a hammer and go looking for nails.
I know.
So from that perspective, I think caste have always found sociology or anthropology more useful than economics. That's what I would say.
So, a bit of a problem that we are facing at Gokhale Institute right now. We have in the second semester a subject called sociology, and I think what most people who are in the SYBSE right now will say or would have said if they felt free enough to say it, is they don't really get why that subject is there. So some people might appreciate it for its own sake, but the linkage between economics and sociology and why you need to study it is going to be always inherently difficult, because a sociologist will approach it from their own domain, and an economist will not want to think about the link between the two. How do we get people to get why it makes sense to study anthropology, philosophy, sociology while studying economics at an undergraduate level? How do you evoke that curiosity and that big picture way of thinking?
I'll start by saying that I completely get where the students are coming from, because
absolutely.
I didn't opt for economic sociology when I was in Gokhale, and it's one of my biggest regrets. And it's very strange because everything I've done since then, I've found economic sociology fascinating. And for some reason, I thought it was a boring subject when I was in Gokhale.
So did I. I wish I had taken it in my undergrad days.
And so economic sociology, it's very interesting because, and it's relevant, particularly if you think of labor economics, the paradigm that you spoke of, that study that you mentioned, the Swana O or something, and so those sort of studies, economic sociology offers an alternative to that, or rather, there are industrial sociologists, there are sociologists who study industrial organization, though industrial organization is more from an economics perspective, transaction cost economics. But anthropologists who are also called economic anthropologists, they are the ones who study markets. So they offer a lot more insight into what you will consider intangible. So earlier I spoke of norms. So norms are these cultural factors, these social factors that you normally cannot quantify. And sociology and anthropology offers qualitative instruments that you can use to sort of document those phenomena much better, and it is much more useful for theory building. That's how I would say economists should look at it. And those sort of theory building, those sort of theories can be the base for further empirical work in economics. That's how I would see it. So for instance, something I did during my thesis is, and I'll be completely frank, I didn't do it with some sort of pre-planned perfect idea of how a thesis should be. I started out by looking at quantitative surveys, the usual thing that everyone does in the IT industry, to get certain data on wages, what kind of designations IT sector people go into, what are their family backgrounds, that sort of thing. The very normal stuff. And what I found is that when you do those sort of surveys, it's very easy for them to fake the data. And after I collected around 25 or 26 data points, or rather collected data from 26 people over several data points, I couldn't find any correlation. And then I realized that IT engineers are busy people. Unlike us, they don't have that much time. And you have to sort of, unlike the usual primary surveys that you do with, say, people in rural areas or a labor, there is a clear class dynamics going on. So when you go to an IT sector person, you have to get an interview with them by writing a formal permission. You have to give them this guarantee that you're not going to give out their data anywhere, and that they're not at risk of losing their jobs. For that reason, I had to come up with another strategy. So the way I did it was, Just like actually you told me that we'll just have a conversation. I told them, let's just have a conversation. And I did 5 or 6 such interviews just as a pilot. I knew I couldn't use their data. So I just interviewed them and I realized that they were much more forthcoming. Then I went back to sociology literature to see how is this methodologically relevant. And I found that there is a huge corpus of literature on qualitative interviews. And unstructured qualitative interviews is a legitimate methodology. And that itself gave me so much insight into how you can study these certain issues that are happening at the realm of employment relations. So this is not the issue of how much money you make or how much skill development do you need to get a promotion, which economists study a lot. But at the realm of what is the nature of relationship between a manager and a worker within a business unit in a large IT company. So that requires more subtle techniques. And then you go into the next realm of studies where if you go into, say, an Infosys office and you're interviewing your 20 people in the office of the boss, the responses become very different. I've collected their phone numbers and I've talked to them outside the office in a cafe. And I'm telling you, the data is completely different. So then economic sociology becomes in the realm of how do you collect data? Where are you collecting data from? This is fascinating stuff. It's something people have studied this from a very scientific point of view, and it's not just viewpoints that, or rather, people basically have put a lot of thought into how to interview to get the best out of these scenarios. And anthropologists also go one step further in trying to understand how you can be sensitive about the so-called subjects that you are studying. Yeah. And I found these techniques far superior to anything that the quantitative economics paradigm looks at. And so I think the best way to go to students, this is something I do during my discussion sessions, is that I start with this caveat that the paper we are going to do this week is from this paradigm. Tell me how this is different from what we did last week, which was from that paradigm. Was it the right way to go about it? So I think I ask the students to come from that side rather than so that they themselves can see the value of taking one kind of approach or a different approach to tackle a different social or political situation. And I think that becomes effective. And when you see it from that point of view, economic sociology becomes very useful. Something I think I can, which I'm planning to do, but I can't recommend it yet because I haven't read these books myself, is that historians of economic thought write textbooks. And I find those textbooks to be the most interesting rather than when, say, a major big name like a Gregory Mankiw or a Daron Acemoglu writing books. Not to say that they're bad, they're excellent books, but when historians of economic thought write books, they think about all these things. They're aware of what is post-Keynesian, what is Marxian, what is Serafian, what is neo-Ricardian, what is neoclassical Austrian. They put all of that in perspective for the students. And then they also say, so this is economics. Then you also have sociologists and anthropologists who've done a lot of things, which also economists study, but they look at it from a different way. Yeah. Now let us look at some microeconomic models. What do you think? I found one textbook by David Colander who does this.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and excellent. I mean, I've just started reading and I found it very useful. And I've been attending the association, the annual Social Science Association meetings of
ASA meetings, yeah.
Yeah, so it just ended early this morning, 6 a.m. So I've been attending that for the last 3 days. David Colander was there. And I attended 3 sessions by the historians of economic society. So I found a lot of these approaches where they're trying to study computation, agent-based modeling. So what has changed? How have macroeconomists changed their viewpoints? There was another session by the Committee on Economic Education in which they talked about how do you move away from teaching textbooks to dealing with practical problems. So one of the teachers was actually explaining how she uses The Economist, the magazine, as a basis for giving weekly assignments. It's not popular with the students because you have to write 500 words every week. But students always find that at the end of the semester, they learn much more about how the theory that we learn in class is applicable in a practical situation. So I think that these are the kind of thoughts that we need to put in. I think historians of economic thought and economic philosophers whom we always ignore. These guys have put a lot of thought into it, so we don't even need to make that effort apart from the fact that reading what they've already done.
Yeah.
If you use that, I think it becomes a lot.
He passed away recently, but David Graeber is a person, an anthropologist who I wish I had read while studying economics. So the way he approaches, say, for example, money and debt is very different from the way we economists approach it. And that, I'm in complete agreement that multifaceted approach was sadly missing when I was learning. And I wish we could do a better job of incorporating it when we teach young people today. Okay, based on a couple of pieces of work of yours that I was able to find on the internet, or at least references to, I'm very curious to hear your answer to this question. How has your thinking about the trade-off between efficiency and privacy changed because of the pandemic?
Oof. I mean, I wouldn't know where to start because while I was working, so after finishing my MA, I went into working with policy think tanks.
Yeah.
Policy think tanks that are of an activist nature, to be frank. So activists have a certain way of thinking. It's a lot of noise, but I really wanted to get into that scenario from the typical classroom setting. I wanted to work in the real world. So as part of that, you see a lot of situations. And so if you're looking at the economics literature on privacy and the trade-offs of efficiency and privacy, it's very different on the ground. And I would say, so I looked at it clearly from the lens of Aadhaar. You may have seen.
Of course. Yes.
I've written a lot about Aadhaar. And even that, I still don't have an answer to anything because when you're supposed to do internships when you're in Google, right? After the first year. And I'd applied to the UIDAI. I'm not even going to lie.
Wow.
Yeah, I didn't get it. And so I went home and I kept reading a lot about Aadhaar, and it's just something doesn't seem right. Why are we looking at things this way? And I ended up reading a lot on the welfare state, or basically the welfare schemes in India, because there's so much, it's so messy. It's you have centrally sponsored schemes, you have each state with their own name, and when each government comes in, they change their names. It's so hard to track. So budget tracking was my job for around 8 years.
And I have a couple of questions about that as well.
So when you do that, you actually see a lot of what happens on the ground, and you end up going to do some field work. You go to these remote areas, and sometimes you have one of the things that really changed my perspective on this issue was I had gone to a village called Dev Dungri. And I mean, as the name suggests, it just sounds like something from People Life. And it's actually that. You go there, and it's just a lot of people just came around, and then they just gave me forms. And I didn't get what was happening. So they were giving me the forms, which were in English. And they were telling me details so that I can fill it for them. And those were in Hindi, but they didn't speak Hindi. And they gave me that form so that they can get their Narega job cards. So, and I was wondering, so this is what is going on. And then application of Aadhaar itself, I started wondering, is Aadhaar really the solution for this? It just sounds like there is no state here. And we always talk about, I think the dominant discourse in the West is state being dominant everywhere, being part of every aspect of our lives, but that's not the case in India. We haven't really had good state penetration, and there is a whole line of thought within political science on state capacity.
Right.
State capacity, unfortunately, for some reason, economists don't take it very seriously in India, and when we should be taking it seriously. But now there are those groups like Karthik Muralidharan who are working on state capacity, and I think
that was an excellent podcast with Amit Verma.
I didn't listen to it, but yeah, I saw it. And so these issues of state capacity really came to mind. And then privacy efficiency trade-off, I really don't know. And I think we have to reach a stage in society where we are okay with parting that much data. And I think parting with that much data means an implicit trust in whoever is collecting that data. If someone is collecting data, privacy is not possible. Let's be real.
Correct.
Because you are giving trust to a group of people, and there is no way we can check whether that is reliable. We can have as many legislations as we want, but the reality is, if somebody is collecting data, that can be hacked. Theoretically, it can be hacked. So the way to ensure privacy is to not collect data at all. So then from there, you look at the issue of something like Aadhaar, where you have to have a centralized database of a lot of database of all our citizens. And then from there, build an authentication mechanism which is trustworthy and ensure accountability and a grievance redressal mechanism in a country where in 60 years we haven't had proper state penetration. So from there, I had written, you might have seen that I've written about privacy, but halfway through writing about a lot of it, I think I kind of lost interest, because I thought there are bigger issues than privacy here. Where is the state? Then I went back to economics. Like, the state is supposed to do certain things. How do we make that happen? And then the question I dealt with was mostly around, is technology a substitute for the state? And a substitute for the absence of state capacity? I don't think so, because people have to constitute the state.
Correct.
And only from that point of view, so that means it's an issue of state capacity. So technology like Aadhaar, whether it's an equity efficiency trade-off or not, I think that's a second order issue. The first order issues that are fixing state capacity. So it is in that context that I came across the work of Professor Atul Kohli. And Atul Kohli is Professor Sitapathi's guide. And so that is actually how I got into Ashoka. Because I wrote to him saying that I really like the stuff on state capacity. And he happened to be looking for people for a teaching fellowship, and I got it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So let me push back against, well, not really push back, but think about, say, for example, Taiwan, China, or South Korea. Without the kind of state surveillance that they had in place, they could not have, you can argue about whether they have been successful in the long term or not, but at least the early success that these countries had in combating COVID would not have been possible without state surveillance.
Yeah.
So from the point of view of COVID specifically and the pandemics that are going to come in the future, whether we like them or not, is that an argument to be made for more, not less, state surveillance?
Well, it's difficult, because I don't think we should make policy on the basis of exceptional circumstances. So COVID is a exceptional circumstance. Well, the way things are going, I don't think it's an exceptional circumstance anymore. But but until this, the last time it happened at this scale was 100 years ago, right? The Spanish flu. And dealing with state capacity, state surveillance. So I think I would distinguish between state capacity and state surveillance.
Yeah, absolutely.
State surveillance. So the very idea of the constitution, that when countries build the constitution, and if you just exclude the post-colonial nations for a bit, countries in the global north, the so-called global north, had constitutions to limit the powers of the state.
Yes.
So they felt that the state is an impingement on personal freedom.
Individual freedom, yeah.
So you have something that allows ordinary people to say, what are you doing to my personal freedom? So the constitution is supposed to be that document. In India, it's something very different.
Yep.
So from that point of view, you have to wonder. I mean, China's situation, it certainly came in handy for them. I would say that they had so much surveillance capability.
Right.
But is it a healthy thing for society? I don't know. I just can't tell, because China-Taiwan situation, it actually puts me in a bind. Because you can't invest that much power in one entity and then expect positive results, because sooner or later it will go wrong. That's what history has taught us. So that power relations, there has to be some way of negotiating those power relations in society. And I think economics deals with those scenarios far less, and political scientists deal with it much better.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's where I am right now. I can't really tell, and I'm trying to understand a lot more about why China was a success, in economically at least, and a lot of the credit goes into how much the Communist Party there invested in state capacity.
Right.
So, is it possible to separate the state surveillance that they do to maintain that power from the state capacity? I don't know.
I would say no.
Yeah. So I wrestle with that all the time. I can't say I have a solution.
Exactly. And before the pandemic, I would have been very definitely anti-state surveillance.
Yeah.
I still am, but I see now greater merit in the argument that the other side makes. And I was curious to see if you're as conflicted as I am, and
Yeah.
you seem to be.
Yeah.
Okay. On the face of it, a flippant question, but I'm quite curious to hear your answer. Rao or Vajpayee, and why?
Sorry?
Narasimha Rao or Atal Bihari Vajpayee? Who was a better prime minister, and why?
It's really hard to make that judgment. Well, I'm sure you're referring to Vinay's book. Because
Not just that, but both
No,
your personal view and your experience of having worked with Vinay on this book.
So, no, I mean, I don't know, because I'll tell you how I look at politics, because it's quite different from the way Vinay looks at politics. And I think that's the reason why he hired me, to be frank. So, I generally don't look at people. And of course, representatives are important, but I think the people are more important than the representatives of people. So when you analyze any sort of political issue, or at least, I mean, I will definitely say that this is my view. It is definitely not the view.
Right.
So I tend to look at literature or look at articles or something that gives me more insight into what are the scenarios or what are the circumstances in which a particular political party or a particular leadership operated, and then give credit to how they negotiated it, for sure. But I think politics has to be about people. So if a question arises, whether it's Rao or Vajpayee, I can't really give a definite answer. I realize I'm being wishy-washy, but I find it difficult to answer questions like that, because I think Rao faced much more challenges than Vajpayee did, but then in many different ways, Vajpayee faced the challenge of having to justify a completely new kind of rule as opposed to anything that came before in India. So to get people used to that itself is a challenge. And we saw that kind of failed after the 6 years. It took them a long time to make a comeback. Right. So from that perspective, it's hard to make that choice. But I think after reading Vinay's book on Narasimha Rao, I gained a whole new appreciation for how Rao operated. And I should really clarify that within political science, American political science, there is a tendency to praise leaders who are cunning in quotes, the Chanakya way, that is. So I would say Princeton political scientists in particular, if you look at the works of Will Riker in the 1960s and the 70s, they tend to write about how there is something to be said about idealism or utopianism. But I think when you are a leader, you have to get results fast. And I think Vinay also kind of that school of thought where leadership should be, or quality of leadership should be assessed on the basis of how they negotiated certain challenges. And according to his book, the argument that he makes is that Rao played a big role in making the 91 reforms happen, which probably would not have been possible in any other leadership. And I think he makes a strong argument in that sort of direction. But I would say that teaching in Ashoka while simultaneously being in JNU is a very weird experience. So, because you move one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum on the course of a day, and I found that experience also very interesting. I would say that no one in JNU would agree with Professor Sitapati's argument. So so if you write some of your students might write the MA entrance exam in JNU, and I'm pretty sure, take it from me, they'll ask a question about structural adjustment. And it would be about critiquing the IMF's position and how they pushed India into structural adjustment. So someone like Vinay actually argues against that, saying that
Exactly.
it would have happened anyway.
Yeah.
And we should have probably done it because otherwise we would have gone into a crisis. So both these arguments are very strongly made, I would say. And it's worth reading both sides. And I guess I am being wishy-washy because I tend to do that, especially when students are around, because I don't want to tell them. I actually picked this up from Vinay, where it's like, I don't want to tell them what to think. I rather tell them, these are the viewpoints, what do you think?
Yeah.
So from that point of view, I'll stay there. I definitely do have strong views on all of this, but I prefer to write them in academic papers. And I think it's a consequence of social media. Because earlier I would be a lot more open about my opinions, and I found that people kind of paint you in a certain way if you
Right.
express those opinions. So I rather keep that to my art papers rather than in a classroom.
So a bit of background for everybody on the call.
Yep.
Rohit, I hate introductions, so I hate wasting time on saying Rohit does this, and so on and so forth. But I think in this case, the background is necessary. Rohit is working with a person called Vinay Sitapati, who teaches, if I'm not mistaken, political science at Ashoka University. And he's the author of two books. One is a biography of Narasimha Rao, Half Lion, and the other is a book called Jugalbandi, which came out just this year. Which is a biography, if you will, not exactly a biography, but a examination of the journey of Vajpayee and Advani together. And I have a lot of questions about Jugalbandi. It was a book that opened my eyes to a whole host of issues that I never thought about, and I'll come to that. But that's pretty much the background to this question that we were just speaking about right now. Here's my take on Narasimha Rao. So if you've read Confessions of a Swadeshi Reformer by Yashwant Sinha, he claims that the plan for reforms was there since when Chandrasekhar was the prime minister. And that may well be true, but I think Narasimha Rao's skill was not just in terms of biting the bullet, but getting people to work together is, at least in my view, a lost art in Indian politics. And both Rao and Vajpayee were very good at this, building consensus and getting people to work together. Is, I think, why Chandrasekhar failed and Narasimha Rao succeeded. And to me, that was perhaps the biggest advantage that both of these gentlemen had. And that's something I wanted to ask you about. Do modern political leaders in India fail this test of the ability to build a consensus, of taking everybody together along? In my opinion, Vajpayee was the last prime minister to have successfully done that at scale.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a challenge. And going back to that we had on norms. So I think it becomes even more difficult in a coalition-based environment. So in India, where you have so many different political groups that are trying to gain power, you have a scenario where some sort of consensus builder, I mean, whoever he is, how brilliant he or she is, it's a difficult job. And I think it's getting even more difficult. So sometimes I think in public economics, you sometimes deal with that question of whether coalition governments are efficient or not. But I think political scientists are far less concerned with efficiency. They look more at representation and issues of governance. And more than governance, also issues of whether whoever comes to power, there is a scope for a wider spectrum of policies. So for instance, the idea of representation is that, or why we need to build some sort of consensus, is that there is a kind of give and take that goes on. So if there is a coalition government that comes to power, and there is some sort of outside support being provided by a large political group that comes from a large state in the central government. Obviously, there is an incentive for that group to lobby for resources from the central government for that particular group in the state.
Correct.
And sometimes I think when you look at it from a public economics point of view, we think of that as inefficient. But from a political scientist point of view, you can definitely make an argument for how that is good for federalism. So I think that's one of the things I learned from looking at political science, which is that the way we look at fiscal federalism. So I think in public economics, you mostly look at fiscal federalism rather than political federalism. So even the work I did after my MA was closely tied to decentralization financing and fiscal federalism, which is around budgets. And you constantly come to this issue of the center kind of cornering all the resources and then having a say in how much has to go to each state.
Right.
What I learned from working in political science is that large literature on political federalism being successful in India. And in the absence of fiscal decentralization, or rather not enough fiscal decentralization, it is actually political federalism that has made it possible. So this coalition governments that have happened over the years, especially the last 30 years, it's these regional political parties, these caste-based parties that have actually been able to argue for or lobby for more resources for groups that have not had resources before. Now, from a typical public economics point of view, that might be seen as inefficient, but that's also better implementation of political federalism.
Yeah.
So coalition building and leadership in that sense becomes a much more important element. So the kind of issue that you mentioned, where leadership over the last 30 years, maybe it's becoming more difficult to bring people together. But I think we are also facing a scenario where one dominant national party is being replaced by another dominant national party. It's not that you have Republican versus Democrat sort of a scenario, but we have large number of small players, and then you have two dominant parties, and one of which is kind of extinguishing itself, and the other which is becoming more dominant. So in that scenario, consensus building also should be easier. And I think we are kind of seeing that. I think GST happened because of that. A lot of the other policies since then also happened because of that. So you have one dominant party and you have one dominant leader. They can kind of push for these sort of policies. But in coalition, so there, I think there is a trade-off. That's basically what. Yeah.
So, the reason I'm having difficulty in framing this question because I can't help but in my mind think about the trade-offs between political and fiscal federalism. So let me get my thoughts on that straight. But before we do that, and while I do that, Gandhar had a question about whether the unity that we spoke of, where caste is a unifying factor, the question that Srikant Krishnamachari posted on Twitter. Gandhar's response at that point was, and this is a question for you, whether this unity has prevented the mass mobilization of the marginalized castes across the country to fight against discrimination, whether this unity itself, in a sense, is a stumbling block.
Yeah. So I would say, when we say caste-based mobilization, I think what we have to be clear about, and it's a very controversial point to make, which is also the reason why political scientists don't go public too often. So, so again, this is something I learned after getting into political science. Earlier, I had a sort of activisty point of view on these things, which is that, I think same as the student mentioned, so Gandhar, right?
Gandhar, yeah.
Gandhar. So I think what Gandhar is talking about is caste-based mobilization. But we have to be very honest in trying to understand that phenomenon is that it's a particular caste and a particular sub-caste based mobilization. There is no cross-caste solidarity. And I think that's a very documentable phenomenon.
Yep.
And within those castes and sub-castes, you have different sub-ethnic castes that dominate a particular caste. And from that point of view, and that's where the politics of reservations comes from. So you have this constant back and forth between those sort of groups. So Christoph Jafferlord is someone who's documented this quite well. And recently there's been a book, I think I might be getting the name wrong, Amit Ahuja. It won some Asia Prize for writing about these ethnicity-based parties in India. I might be getting the name wrong, but I think it's a very easy book to find. So there is a lot of, Kanta Murali is someone who's also written about this, where caste mobilization definitely has happened on the basis of particular caste. So even certain political parties that we see as representations of progressive caste-based politics, I think if you analyze it much closely, you will see that even those political parties are dominated by one subcaste, which is why more and more subcaste-based ethnic parties end up. And you saw those parties play a crucial role in the Bihar elections recently. So I think unifying force of caste is something that is much further away from, say, how Ambedkar imagined it, or someone like Kanshi Ram imagined it. It's quite far away. So you can even look at the party that Kanshi Ram started itself is dominated by one subcaste.
The PhD, yeah.
Yeah. So I have those books somewhere here. So I think one of the books that you might consider looking at is Badri Narayan's You Can't See It. Okay.
Unfortunately not.
I think
Is a biography of Kanshi Ram?
Yes,
Wonderful.
by Badri Narayan.
I haven't read this one. I'll make a note of it.
Very interesting book. So it's about how he mobilized groups of people in UP and Punjab. So there are lots of these sort of biographies that look at these issues, but what comes clearly across in all of these studies is that it's definitely based on one or two castes that become dominant within that larger subcaste. So it's very difficult to argue that there is cross-caste solidarity in politics. That's what I would say.
And at least to me, this is a bit of a surprise. One of the things that resonated and surprised me was towards the end of Jugalbandi about how it is a BJP that has successfully overcome, well, successfully still open for debate, but amongst all political parties, it seems to be the party that has most successfully overcome the inter-caste divide, if you will. The unifying factor there is, of course, overt Hinduism. But if you had asked me 20 years ago, I wouldn't have picked BJP as a party to successfully mobilize and unite along caste dimensions.
Yeah.
But the way they have done it, and that too with the help of the RSS, was one of the most surprising things I learned by reading Jugalbandi. How much of a surprise was it to you, or was it a thesis that you and Vinay already had in mind when you were working on this book?
No, I would say this is something Vinay worked on completely on his own. I wasn't a part of this process. So he had finished writing the book when I had joined. So and from that point of view, so the argument that he makes in the book, I think, is about how Vinay is offering the course this coming semester, a separate course on the book.
Oh, lovely. Okay.
Yeah. So now I think one of the arguments that he makes, something that the BJP successfully did, or that was the background of the political duo that dominates India, is that they were, or rather their political careers were forged out of their sort of activism in Gujarat in the 80s, where there was, I think they noticed this phenomenon that unless purely in numerical terms, if you don't have cross-caste solidarity, it is impossible to get a majority and come to power.
Correct.
And it's actually a very pragmatic decision that they took. So, and the way they decided to do it was by using political Hinduism. So political Hinduism becomes a tool for them to find that cross-caste solidarity. So earlier I was saying about how ethnic parties were unable to form cross-caste solidarity. They were successful in forming majorities within a particular circumstance, within a particular state, but being able to put castes together and using the Hindu vote, an unfortunate consequence of that is that when you're putting together the Hindu vote, it has to be against the Muslim vote. And that's one of the sad repercussions of the rise of the particular political party that we're talking about. And I think from the 80s onwards, they tried to do this, but I think it's only in the last 10, 15 years that they've actually been successful. And like you, I remember when I was in Gokhale, it was then that they announced that Narendra Modi was going to be the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And I remember reading it in Mint, because Mint was a new newspaper then. I remember reading it and laughing. These guys are not serious. Are they going to lose another election? And I mean, I said that in my naivety, not that I understood politics in any detail then. But I remember reading it and laughing that they are not going to do anything. But they kind of changed it around in 2 years.
Yeah.
And it's quite impressive how their organization worked. And I think Vinay's book contributes to that literature, something that we don't know, that behind all of this is a machine. And they're a machine, they are very analytical, they know what they're doing, and that's why they're successful.
So I'm sure Rohit has read it, but for the benefit of everybody else on the call, you should really combine Jugalbandi with a book called How the BJP Wins by Prashant Jha. So the idea comes from Jugalbandi, the execution comes from Prashant's book. And
Yeah.
we need to read both to understand how the BJP is what it is today.
Yeah.
Sorry, please go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I agree with you. And I think, so obviously, in class, we don't deal with just the BJP. I think you'll deal with that in the separate course that Vinay is offering next semester. So, as part of our course, which the last 2 semesters we did in Introduction to Indian Politics. So it's mostly for students who are first years. There are also second years and third years, but mostly first years who want to get into, or at least get a taste of what political science looks like. I can maybe just share a bit of the course structure.
Please.
So the way Vinay likes to teach is that the first half of the course is purely political history. And I think there's no one way of teaching this, because Indian politics itself is not a course that's offered anywhere else in India, strangely.
I know, yeah.
Because in political science departments as well, you start with what is democracy, what is state political party, what is federalism. And it's just...
It puts everybody to sleep.
Yeah, and you can't associate with what you see daily in politics.
Correct.
So the thing that I think during my interview, what he asked me was, I don't really care about what you know about democracy or not. I'm sure you're doing a PhD, you should be able to pick it up. But tell me something about this party, that party. Have you heard of Vijay Raje Scindia? So, and I think one of the parting things, we were in a cafe right before the lockdown when we actually could go to cafes. So I think he asked me something, because I'm from Kerala, he asked me something about the left there and what I think of the left rule there. And I said, but I don't think Kerala is the first place where the left rule came to power democratically. And he said, like, really, no, I think it was in San Marino. So I had happened to read about it somewhere. So I think that's what clinched the interview, because he saw that I remember places and things really well. And I think in an Intro to Indian Politics course, something which I felt very strongly when I finished MA in Gokhale was that, again, this is not to say anything about Gokhale, but after 5 years of BA and MA, can we honestly say we know the names of all our prime ministers? Do we really know the names of all our presidents? Do we know all the coalitions? Do we know all the major historical points? It's very basic knowledge. It's very Wikipedia knowledge, but we actually don't know it. So how can we get into concepts of democracy without really understanding the names and places and the things? So the first part of the Intro to Indian Politics course actually is political history. So Vinay does this classification where he defines it through the era of a political leader. So first is colonialism, building of the modern state. The second is Constitution and the Nehru years. The third is Indira Gandhi years. And then you have the Rajiv Gandhi years and the Rao years. And then you have Modi. So Modi is like a very speculative part, and which he leaves for the last thing. But
it's still being written, correct?
Yeah. So he leaves that for more for this, like a general discussion. But I think he prefers discussing fiction. One work of fiction that we deal with in class is Raag Darbari.
Oh, what a book.
Raag Darbari by Srilal Shukla, and I made an effort to read it in Hindi. And I reading it in Hindi is a completely different, Shashank agrees. So, I mean, when you read that, like having studied in Kendriya Vidyalaya, I haven't forgotten my Hindi. So I'm able to read it. But the sarcasm is brilliant. I have to say, actually, it's quite fun. And we deal with it in class, and we have a longer response paper on the basis of that. And it's exactly to showcase this, that Nehru's imagination of how India should look like is very different on the ground. Yeah. And there is something to be said that imagination failed, even though we see some levels of success because of that, the establishment of democracy, or how much we value democracy in India. So there is a line that Vinay often uses in class, that people are less bothered about laws that are passed. Even if there are protests against laws, it's always by a certain group of elites somewhere.
Right.
If the right to vote is taken away, everybody will be on the streets. And that's, I think that is something that comes from the political education that we've had through the Constitution. That's Nehru's vision somewhat implemented. But what we failed in is in establishing a state that can deliver on those promises that democracy offers. So I think it's very useful to think of it that way. And only in the second part of our course do we go into concepts. And when we go into concepts, we try to get into political science papers. So the latest academic papers that some classic, but some latest papers. So if you have Adam Przeworski, someone like Adam Przeworski, who's written about the modernization hypothesis, something we take for granted in economics, that the idea that we are in a relentless march towards development. And so literature challenging the modernization hypothesis. And another reason for which I guess I was hired is that in India, the political scientists are still of the old variety. So the kind of political science that we have in the USA or Europe today is more what economists would like. So there is a lot of econometrics involved, a lot of empirical data analysis, a lot of graphs and regressions. So
I'm not sure that that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's not a good thing. But actually that's what political, and it's taught as political economy. So that's what I was saying in the beginning, where the way political scientists see political economy and how an economist sees political economy is very, very different.
Yeah.
So one of the examples I can use is, Daron Acemoglu is called a political economist. He's called many different things. He writes about everything. He's so prolific. I tried to download all his papers. It took me 2.5 days. And just to download his papers. And something that you see from the kind of work that he does, it's from a certain paradigm, right? It's to establish fact in what is very in certain intangible phenomenon, or at least perceptibly intangible phenomenon. But on the other hand, political economy, what you call Indian political economy by a classic textbook like Francine Frankel. It's more about Nehru rule, Green Revolution, Indira Gandhi. What were the structural factors that changed? So I think we need a mix of both approaches because it's useful. One is descriptive. I'm a fan of descriptive literature, so I read a lot more of that. But coming from an economics background, you can't get away from mathematical modeling and regression. And so you have to teach a bit of that too. So I think even in Ashoka, it's the same problem that we had in Gokhale, I think, which is that whenever it goes into the quant stuff, students find it uncomfortable. And I think it's important to share more of the intuition behind those ideas. So and I think that's something I learned from your class as well. So I remember you teaching Wallace Oates and those sort of
decentralization.
And those, I really used that in the first job I got was actually using all of that. So I really went back and read all of the literature that you prescribed in class. And one of the assignments that you gave in class was about critiquing the FRBM Act.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, I milked that. Since getting into my first job on budget analysis, this was the debate: fiscal deficit this, revenue deficit that. I got into that completely. And I generally, so when you're teaching a class, introductory class, you have to introduce students to these sort of different paradigms that exist. And again, going back to the thing that I was saying earlier, which is that you have to tailor your, or rather you have to formulate your research questions based on the kind of issues that are at hand. And then see what are the tools that are appropriate to that particular scenario. And both kind of stuff work. And I think in the last 3 days, the ASSA meetings that I attended, David Colander was presented a paper where he was talking about little think and big think. And I need to read the paper properly to understand what he meant. But I think he was referring to this, that economists spend too much time on little think, which is that these sort of puzzle formations and solving puzzles through models, than big think, which is more about deductive reasoning over very large scope. So it's when you try to apply big think that neoclassical economics, you can see some flaws, but within the little think, neoclassical economics works really well. But going from that session to Daron Acemoglu's session, it was really fun hearing him say that. So when we, and I think he had a good point when he tried to sort of justify the neoclassical model, where he said, so when we are talking about the first welfare theorem or the Arrow-Debreu result, do we really tell students that this is a theoretical mathematical result to explain the invisible hand? I don't think we do. And I mean, something blew in my head, like, he's right. I never thought of it that way. I just, we have to study Arrow-Debreu theorem. We have a public economics exam tomorrow. And I think this makes all the difference. So all of this has to be.
Anushay had a question from a long time back, and let me know if you're not doing okay on time. So we are scheduled to go until 11:30, but anytime you want to leave, Rohit, we can wrap up.
No, I'm fine.
Oh, all right. So Anushay's question was about whether sports and politics isn't really the best thing to compare, because loyalty in sports is, in a sense, easier because of the club-based format, and players keep on shifting from one party to the other. But Anushay, there used to be a very popular phrase in Indian politics called Ayaram Gayaram, which basically speaks about how politicians keep effortlessly switching between political parties. So my take on this, your question, Anushay, is it seems to be the same, in fact, even worse in Indian politics than it is in sports. But what would your answer be, Rohit?
Well, I think speaking about sports, I think we scoff upon people who shift loyalties between clubs, right? I mean, we really can't take seriously anyone who, so if you supported Man United all your life and suddenly you decide to become a Liverpool fan, you know why the reason is. So it's a bit, and I found this very interesting. So I think Anushay is talking about anti-defection.
Yeah.
So I think there is a recent article by Gilles Vernier, who's also a faculty of political science, and he's set up the Trivedi Center for Political Data in Ashoka, which is like this. Well, it's not new anymore. It's been around for a while now, but they collect a lot of data on polling data. And there was an interesting analysis that he wrote a couple of months ago, right, at least around the time of the Bihar elections, where he wrote about how there are a lot of by-elections that are taking place because of defection. So BJP is exclusively using this as a strategy throughout every state. It's not related to one state, throughout every state, to the point where they've gained almost 57 seats, something absurd like that. And it's gone completely under the radar. And so I think that's a problem. And I don't think it's very healthy for democracy. But the reality is they're winning elections, right? So I don't know if you can even call it anti-democratic. It's not anti-democratic. They're probably sort of playing the game and winning the game really successfully.
Within the letter of the law, as it were.
Yeah. So if you, it's a bit like, if you're, I'm sorry to use football metaphors, but I know, Ashish, you also follow football. So it's a bit like how I think I started following Arsenal at a time when they used to be successful. So, and unfortunately, by the time I was a full-fledged Arsenal fan, I saw Man United beat Arsenal 8-2 in the Gokhale hostel. So it's one of the most. And then when I moved to Delhi, I looked for a cafe that where I could see an Arsenal match just to get that fan atmosphere. And I saw Chelsea beat Arsenal 6-0 in Arsene Wenger's 1000th match.
1000th match, yeah.
So, and I mean, from that perspective, it's basically that loyalty. It's an interesting way to phrase it. So if you look at anti-defection laws exist precisely to avoid the sort of rigging that happens. But if the rigging happens and then you have elections that take place and the parties win elections on the basis of these new candidates, I would say it's actually very hard to argue against it, because ultimately you are winning the game. So I had started with the football metaphor because Arsenal started out as a team that was nasty, or at least the reputation being that big, strong guys, just elbow people in the face and referees don't see it.
I'm old enough to remember Pizzagate.
Yeah. From there onwards, there used to be a change in Arsenal's style to this sort of technical, silky football built by very diminutive players. So at that time, referees would be, or at least the perception was that referees are against Arsenal players. And because Arsenal still had a reputation for being a nasty team, but filled with what the sexist English commentators would call a team of sons-in-laws. So, but a good little boys who only play football, who don't care about all these technical, all of that stuff. But basically, I'm using the metaphor to give the example that somewhere along the way, a football team forgot how to play the intangible aspects of the game really well, but just focused on playing that game properly. But I think if you use that same metaphor in politics, you have to be real here. BJP played the game well, Congress lost out. That's the reality. And I think if you want democracy to function better, or at least when we imagine democracy to function better, you would want leaders to have a larger vision of what development should look like. We want all of them to tackle climate change. We want all of them to tackle air pollution, but none of that happens. So it's a much larger problem. So I think so from the perspective of political science, what the literature offers is that, so if you distinguish between left and right politics within the sphere of democracy. So if you think about extremes, left politics does not value democracy at all. It prefers functioning in outside the state or forming groups of people. But if you put the caveat that you're looking at the social democrats, that is, the CPIM in India is a social democratic party. It's not a communist party.
Yeah.
So in that sense, what those guys want is a sort of social justice, everything going towards rights-based laws, and you also want a scenario where people are better represented in its politics. So you want better legislature functioning. It's not just about the executive. But if you move towards the right, they are completely all right with the executive taking over all the functions, because the executive was chosen by the people ultimately.
Right.
So even if the legislature doesn't function properly at every single level, they're fine with it, because ultimately the legislature, they're voted by the people. But if they are also choosing the executive, and the executive is performing all the functions, ultimately they were indirectly elected by the people. So they can do whatever they want within the 5 years, obviously within the bounds of law. So I think that's the difference that political scientists think that. And in India, we have like from a political party point of view, the biggest opposition is not the Congress party, right? At least in the public domain, the biggest opposition actually comes from the sort of liberal left that want the state to function better. So they work through the legislature, they work through the judiciary, or rather, my criticism of them, in spite of being a part of that group in my critique of Aadhaar, is that they always look towards the judiciary for solutions, when I've always preferred, let's make the standing committees work better so that our laws are better. So if any of the students are interested, you should look at the work of PRS Legislative Research. Excellent research.
Excellent, yeah.
And it's also actually one of the reasons why I moved to Delhi, because I had gotten an internship with them. But I didn't pursue it because I got a full-time job somewhere else.
Okay.
On budget analysis. So it was essentially going to be the same. Either I work with an MP or I indirectly work with an MP through budget analysis. So one of the reasons why I came to Delhi was to do this, to get a better idea of how this functions. And I think that's the perspective that you can look at when we try to understand party loyalties, because ultimately people shift parties because they feel that they'll get elected in the new party that they're joining, and that's not anti-democratic. It's it's within the democratic paradigm, and they're doing it successfully.
With they're coming to power successfully, I don't think they're really successful in terms of living up to the ethos of democracy. But that's just my personal opinion. And by the way, that I think is what Gandhar was asking. So if you don't mind taking a look at the chat section, Gandhar and in a sense, I would say Jeet have very interrelated questions. 10:59 a.m. and 11:01 a.m.
Okay. Jeet's question is very interesting because it's something that we parallelly deal with in our class all the time, because it's a question that students always have. And I'll tell you Vinay's on this, and not just Vinay's position. I think it's a very accepted. There is a consensus around this in South Asian politics, which is that parties in India are people-centric. Yeah. They're always centered around one political party. Can you honestly say that BJP is a right-wing party? We say it's a right-wing party, but their ideology is not right-wing at all.
Economic ideology certainly is very, very left-leaning.
And so if they promote Narega, they came out saying that Narega is a problem. I think Arun Jaitley, when he was the finance minister, he said Narega is a problem, we need to get rid of it. But ultimately they raised the budget allocation because they saw that it has a lot of political support from the people. And that's actually a democratic response, I should say. A party responding to the people's needs. That's how it should be. And so India actually does not have political parties that subscribe to the kind of economic ideology that Europeans or North Americans have. We don't have it. Our parties are explicitly either caste-based or we have parties that are very based on an individual. Can you honestly say, I mean, Aam Aadmi Party came out with a lot of promise in 2014, 2016 and all, but it's definitely centered around Arvind Kejriwal. You can't say TMC, what is it? I mean, what is the TMC ideology? I don't know what their ideology is. Trinamool Congress. Yeah. So if you think of BJD in Orissa, Bharatiya Janata Dal, sorry, Biju Janata Dal.
Biju Janata Dal.
And, I mean, it's called Biju Janata Dal. And it's and in Kerala, if I can give you an example of the Congress is splintered into I don't know how many. So there's Kerala Congress J group, Kerala Congress B group, C group. The left is splintered into RSPB, RSPC, RSP standing for Revolutionary Socialist Party. This has nothing to do with ideology. It has everything to do with individual people dominating a party. All of them have one seat each. So in India, we don't have that sort of an economic ideology, and that comes from the whole diversity aspect of it, because we have group-based politics operating because we have so many groups to cater to, and we have liberal democracy which is supposed to cater to individual freedom, and it being applied to a group-based society. And I think reading Pratap Bhanu Mehta gave me a lot of counterintuitive insights into how Indian democracy operates, and I could listen to him all day. He's such a genius. I mean, there are a lot of lectures of his up freely on YouTube. I think students should read it. Unfortunately, he doesn't write enough books. He writes a lot of Indian Express op-eds.
Columns, yeah.
Yeah, and I wish he wrote more books because he has so much interesting things to say, particularly about the application of Hindu religion on the Indian state. And it's some of the most complicated ideas that I have ever read. And I feel every time I have to teach that in a class, I get nervous because it's such a complex thought. Because if you think about it, in one of the basics of the emergence of democracy in the West is the separation of the church and the state. You can't use the same in India. So he's basically trying to come up with an Indian theory where how did the state play a role in incorporating or regulating the Hindu religion, and how that itself resulted in a lot of problems with how the state and religion operate in India. So I think these are the different things that we can, there is a fantastic documentary, some would call it partisan, and I think I'm giving away my politics when I recommend this documentary. Adam Curtis had a series of documentaries in the BBC. I can't remember the name of the documentary, but it's up on his YouTube account. You can search for Adam Curtis. And he talks about how advertising as an industry has contributed to political campaigning, and it's an application of psychologist Freud's ideas in politics. So basically, all the stuff we take for granted in how measuring people's perception. So all the dystopian fiction TV shows that we see today, like I don't know, Black Mirror, or something like Westworld. If any of you follow these shows, so it's all about the application of hyper data into how people's perceptions can be sort of modified through certain kind of political campaign, and then influence the voting through that. So what Adam Curtis argues in his documentary is that we haven't had proper politics since the 1990s. He shows it through the examples of Bill Clinton's election and Tony Blair's elections, and showed how there has been this change in strategy that political parties have followed in the West, where we stopped talking about large issues or visions of politics, and we started talking about minor little things that cater to minor little groups of people here and there. So in the USA, that's what you see, the phenomenon of, if you follow CNN News or Fox News, you'll hear them talking about soccer moms. What is a soccer? So soccer mom apparently itself is a category that was used in marketing and advertisement to cater to white women who have a family in the suburbs of the USA. And I would also recommend a fantastic podcast by Radiolab. And Radiolab had a fantastic podcast during the recent US elections to showcase how this has been used by the Republican Party in the last elections. And apparently these advertisement strategists categorize voters within the USA into these groups, and then see what kind of advertisement categories would work for, or what kind of policies would work for a certain category. So Gujaratis who run hotels in USA is a large enough category. They have policies that cater to that group, and they are actually Trump supporters. So because Trump is from the hotel industry, he tends to favor the hotel industry.
Yep.
And a lot of the small motels that are run in the USA are by Patels from Gujarat. So the strategists go into that much detail, and effectively the idealist politics that we dream of or we think of doesn't exist anymore. So I think Adam Curtis's documentary kind of showcases that really well. And if you want a more modern take and a more, I would say, if you want a more non-partisan take, I would say the Radiolab documentary is much more useful. In any case, I think you should listen to Radiolab because it's a fantastic podcast.
I haven't listened to this one. I'll start now.
Yeah.
Okay. And for the students, if you want an economist's take on this, and it's a fairly dystopian one, it's a very short book, but impossibly difficult to read. But still, give it a try. The Calculus of Consent by Tullock and Buchanan is a wonderful book to read about why what Rohit speaks about is inevitable, and why the utopian dream of issue-based politics is all but impossible. If you understand the book, it's a very depressing book. It's a very difficult one to read as well. So a couple of questions from the students. One, Sahil asks, I'm going to name names. Sahil was rather more euphemistic. Is anything likely to replace the Congress, or is it just going to be the BJP versus local state parties now? Is that how it is going to play out in the near future?
I think the thing with Indian politics is it's notoriously hard to predict.
Yeah.
So because of the diversity that we have and the kind of party loyalties and the new caste-based parties that emerge constantly, it's very hard to predict. And so if you follow the Cambridge Analytica debates the world over, so connecting to the earlier thing I was saying about how these sort of strategies are catered to certain groups of people. So in India, it's actually much harder because of the diversity that we have. And on top of that, it has also been shown that Cambridge Analytica type approaches that guarantee a result for a particular political party itself is hype. Yeah. And that hype itself gets them the deal. So it's okay for them. But when we say that is destroying democracy, we are missing a larger point. So I've written about Cambridge Analytica in India before. And then I think I had written for a website that I mean, it's a very non-partisan website. So I have to
tone it down a little.
neutral way, so I wasn't able to give my actual opinions on it. But in that article, what I was trying to say was, what did Cambridge Analytica actually try to do? It basically tried to reach out to the Congress. It tried to reach out to another party. It also met some BJP leaders. And ultimately, they didn't get a deal. That's all that happened. But it was reported in the news as if Cambridge Analytica is coming in, they are destroying Indian democracy, but it didn't happen. And so in that sense, so just to get another point about issue-based politics versus idealist politics, and this is an old debate, it's actually not new at all. If you go back to the Tudors in the 15th, 14th century in the UK, and Thomas More, who was Henry VIII's advisor.
Yeah.
So Thomas More wrote Utopia exactly explaining this phenomenon. Thomas More was utopian, while Henry VIII was probably one of the first pragmatists who tried to form an alliance with other European leaders so that Europe could maintain peace, but ultimately broke that own promise by going to war with France. And so this has been an age-old debate, and we are just seeing that operate under democracy. So all this data stuff is just, the medium is changing, but issues have always been the same. Occasionally you have one leader coming in, like a Barack Obama, who's quite special, I think. So another book, if you want to get that sense of a practical viewpoint, is actually Dreams of My Father. Dreams of My Father. Brilliant. Of My Father. I read the book. It's fascinating. And you also realize that someone whom we consider idealistic, say Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was a pragmat of the highest order. And if you read his book, Long Walk to Freedom, it's absolutely pragmatic. Every decision that he made, to stay in jail, to get out of jail, the alliances that he formed to abolish apartheid, every decision he took was from a very practical sense. Martin Luther King, whom we assume to be an idealist, he tried to work with all the groups that he could work with from a very pragmatic point of view. Now, unfortunately, some of his policies rubbed people the wrong way, and that's what ended up him being assassinated. Gandhi, why do we need to go to the USA or South Africa? Gandhi was an absolute pragmat. There's a reason why he's called a political genius. All his messaging, everything, ahimsa, non-violence, everything, it's a strategy. It's an image. He was the first strategist to showcase India as a brand, and he was very successful at that. So it's not a new phenomenon. We're just seeing a very marketized, commodified version of this. That's what.
And well, I was going to tell Sahil to take the long view, but you took the impossibly long view, went back 500 years. I was going to tell him that if in 1984 somebody had told you that it would be the BJP that would have 300 seats and it would be the Congress that would have around 40, this is 1984 when the Congress had around 480, if I remember correctly, and the BJP had just 2. Things change not very rapidly, but across 2 to 3 decades, you'll be surprised at how much changes in Indian politics.
Yeah.
Raj Lakshmi has a question about which I am very pessimistic, but I'd be curious to hear your response. Is caste an integral part of one's identity? And I'm referring, of course, to it from a point of view of an Indian identity. And will it ever cease? My answer is no, but I'd be curious to hear yours.
Well, having read a bit of sociology, I would be lying if I said, I wish it's not an integral part of Indian identity, but it still plays a role. So it's hard to say that it doesn't. And I think that's where I go back into these approaches that I mentioned, like Anthony Giddens' structuration. To try to understand how caste kind of operates in our daily dealings. How caste can become a proxy. And I think in economics also there is a really emerging field brought forward by William Darity called stratification economics. So in that they look at it very strongly, where they see how race plays a role in political economy of wealth creation in the USA. And there are, they get very strong results, and they are able to, I don't think we've had similar studies in India because our data is much worse. But there you have household wealth surveys and insurance, savings, mortgage data, which they can use and actually showcase that even the last presentation that I attended of ASSA I think it was at 2 a.m. Was some, so I don't know how much I absorbed it, but it was a very interesting presentation where the professor actually showed that all policies followed by the US government explicitly catered to wealth creation for higher median wealth households in the US. And he actually showed that through the data. And it's a paper forthcoming in the review of Black political economy. So I think I'll read the paper before agreeing with his findings. But it's a damaging indictment of how policy operates, because I think it's very possible to make those sort of arguments in India too. So following the COVID lockdown in India, you saw the distress that was caused to stranded migrants. And the policy that have been followed as a labor student of labor studies, passing laws to make sure that it's okay for people to work 12 hours in factories. I don't know in what planet we can even justify. I think economists get too lost in these debates of efficiency and just forget the sheer humanitarian nonsense that is. You cannot expect people to live in a democratic society and work like that. So something I've done, especially after the COVID lockdown, is that I've gone back to some of radical literature to not to get a sense of their theoretical arguments, but because radical literature also has a better focus on history. So if you go back to emergence of how we see labor laws today, it has a lot to do with modern European history. So I think I mentioned Henry VIII because of that, because I've been reading a lot about English working class history and German working class history, and around that time, and how labor emerged as an important category from communist activism, and what were the prevailing ideas that these guys were trying to argue against, the role played by anarchists. So just to see from there if it's a comparative perspective possible with what Indian labor historians do. Because Indian labor historians, what they always study is about indentured labor and the kind of the textile mill strike that took place in the Saurashtra region. I think Mumbai was one of the textile strikes. There are fantastic books on that. So these sort of emergence of industrialization, I think these play an important role in the political economy of development prior to independence. I think we don't study that enough in economics, and I think it plays an important role in how capitalism established or failed to establish adequately in India. I think I remember why I said this point, because I'd written it down here. I had opted for a paper in Gokhale, which I was very disappointed that Gokhale didn't offer, which is a paper on economic history. So I was hoping this was one of the subjects that would be taught, because I think we missed out.
Absolutely.
And it's not just Gokhale, I think it's more universities I've seen kind of don't have faculty for economic history. It's very sad. So economic history, history of economic thought, and theories or approaches that focus on the pluralism in economics, all of this exposes students to a much wider perspective. And then you actually realize that economics is not just this narrow view of models and how models apply to the real world. It's a lot more variety, and it's a lot more fun. There is a lot of joy in learning so many different approaches, and you can actually pick and choose your tools.
God, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, Rohit, we're almost out of time. And in fact, a little background for you. So the idea behind these talks is to give people who are unsure about what they want to do after their undergrad studies, expose them to what people who have passed out from Gokhale and a couple of other folks have been doing in these particular careers. So we had people from the startup world, we had people from analytics. Apte sir gave one talk on agrarian reforms in India. And yours today was about if people want to explore the field or realm of political science, what it might look like and how much you're going to have to read.
Yeah.
All right. Rohit, thank you so much for your time. If you slept at 2, hopefully you'll get some sleep before you do whatever it is that you've planned for the rest of the day.
Thank you. It was great talking to you and seeing so many students. I didn't expect so many students to show. So it's actually fantastic, and I hope you do more of these talks, because I definitely think when I was at that age, I look forward to these sort of talks, and there were far fewer than we have today. And thank you for organizing this, and it's great to talk to you after so many years.
Same here, Rohit. Thank you so much.